On the evening of February 20th, 2013, 49-year-old coach Jimmy McLean blew his whistle and brought basketball practice to an end inside of a high school gym in Memphis, Tennessee. His young players rushed to the sidelines and gathered up around Jimmy. And even amongst a group of basketball players, Jimmy looked big. He was 6'4", but his long arms and legs made him seem even taller. And even though he was almost 50 years old, he still completely looked like he could get out on that court and play. Jimmy told the kids they had a great practice, and he told them what he wanted them to focus on over the next few days. Jimmy and the other coaches had led the team to a great season, but they all had their eyes on a state championship, and Jimmy knew how much hard work and focus it would take to get there. Jimmy had been an incredible high school basketball player in his own right back in Arkansas where he grew up. He'd gone on to play at the University of Central Arkansas alongside Chicago Bulls legend Scottie Pippen, and after college, Jimmy actually played ball in a professional minor league for years. And so now, the young men on his team looked up to Jimmy because of his illustrious basketball career, but also they admired him because he was one of their teachers and mentors, and they knew he cared about them as people first and as players second. Jimmy just wanted them to do their best and take care of each other, win or lose. Jimmy told the team to go hit the showers and then go home and hit the books. He had a quick talk with the other coaches and then headed out to his car in the school parking lot. The drive home took Jimmy about 30 minutes away to Cordova, a suburb that was made up of secluded neighborhoods filled with huge homes that had perfectly manicured lawns. Jimmy had lived here in Cordova for about 15 years, but there were still times it felt like a different world from the small Arkansas town he'd grown up in. But as he got older, Jimmy had really come to embrace Cordova as his home, and he knew living there had allowed him to pursue his passions. Jimmy loved basketball, but sports was not all that he cared about. He was also a very talented writer, and he was a devout Christian who felt a calling to serve God and his community. And so during his time in Cordova, Jimmy had written his first book and become a pastor at a local church, two dreams he'd had since he was a kid. A little after 8:30 p.m., Jimmy pulled onto a street which looked like most of the other streets in town. He drove past the driveway of his large 4-bedroom house, parked by the curb, and then hit the button on his garage door opener. Jimmy took a deep breath and watched as the garage door opened. In public places like church or school, Jimmy was outgoing, energetic, and confident. But there was a different side to Jimmy, a side that only the people closest to him ever saw. In private, Jimmy often got really anxious, and some people even said obsessive, about the littlest of things. Once the garage door was all the way open, Jimmy swung his car around and backed down the driveway all the way into the garage, with his car facing out onto the street. Then once he was parked inside, he pushed the garage door button again, and he sat in his car watching the garage door close. This order of how he would go about parking his car was something he did every single time he came home, and he never changed the routine. He would always sit there in the car watching the door until it came all the way closed. Once the door was closed, Jimmy grabbed his leather bag out of the passenger seat, got out of his car, unlocked the door that led from the garage into the house, and he walked inside. Once he was inside, he locked the door he had just come through and went right to the front room of the house. There, he carefully laid his bag down on a leather couch and then very carefully placed his keys on top of the bag, just like he did every single night when he got home from practice. After all that, Jimmy walked over to the leather couch that matched the chair that he had just put his bag and keys on, and he took off his sport coat, folded it along the sleeves, and laid it over the arm of this couch. And then once that ritual was complete, he went towards the front door, leaned down, and then slid a small rug that was in the entryway up against the bottom of the door. He would say he did this to keep the draft out. Jimmy never missed any of these steps when he got home, and he would go through them again in reverse order when leaving for work in the morning. People who loved Jimmy usually just got used to his particular habits, but they also knew Jimmy had a lot of trouble adjusting to how other people did things. And also, Jimmy really did not like to be confronted about his routines. Jimmy's phone buzzed inside of his pocket, and he smiled. Right on time, he thought. He grabbed his phone, and he read a text message from his girlfriend, Carlotta Smith. Her message said, "How was practice?" And Jimmy replied, "Great!" Carlotta lived almost 3 hours away in Nashville, Tennessee, so Jimmy only saw her maybe a few times a month. But they made sure to text or call each other every morning and every night. And Carlotta always seemed to know exactly when Jimmy got home from school. Now, the long-distance aspect of their relationship could get frustrating, but Jimmy couldn't remember the last time he was this happy. Jimmy was technically still married, but he and his wife had separated 4 years earlier, and they had finally started divorce proceedings. But Jimmy had been slow to get into another serious relationship. Part of him still felt loyal to his soon-to-be ex-wife and her 2 kids, who he was a stepfather to. But when Jimmy had met Carlotta 6 months earlier, he knew almost right away that he was falling in love all over again. Jimmy slipped his phone back into his pocket, and he walked through the room past the fireplace and towards the kitchen, but he suddenly stopped. He thought he heard something. Jimmy stood there for a second, and then he heard the sound again. It was coming from somewhere out front of the house. He turned around and walked towards one of the windows that overlooked the front yard, but there was nothing out there, and it was totally silent. And so Jimmy figured, he was just being anxious, like there's nothing going on here. So he left the window and headed back towards the kitchen, but then he heard another sound right behind him, and this time he knew something was right outside his front door. At 8:40 p.m. that night, so just a few minutes after Jimmy had gotten home, his next-door neighbor was home and having a bite to eat at the dining room table when he suddenly heard popping sounds. Now, the sounds were loud enough that the neighbor immediately stopped eating, got up, went to the window to look outside, but they didn't see anything, and they didn't hear anything. Now, the neighbor knew the sounds he had heard could have been gunfire, but it also could have just been some kids setting off firecrackers, like he really didn't know. But just in case, he grabbed his phone off the table and he called the non-emergency number for the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. And when they picked up, he explained to the operator that he just heard these loud sounds right nearby that he thought maybe could be gunfire. The operator told him to stay in his house and that an officer would be over right away. And sure enough, a few minutes later, a Shelby County deputy knocked on the neighbor's door, and Jimmy's neighbor told him what he had told the operator. The deputy thanked him and said he'd take a look around and see if he could find anything, and then he left the neighbor's house and headed back towards his cruiser. The deputy drove around the small neighborhood several times and did what he thought was a thorough patrol of the area. But he didn't find anything suspicious, so finally he went back to Jimmy's neighbor and told him, everything seemed fine. Then the deputy left and drove back to the station, and Jimmy's neighbor tried to calm his nerves and not worry too much about the strange sounds. Two days later, on the morning of February 22nd, 2013, one of Jimmy's fellow basketball coaches sat in the high school's front office across from a school administrator, and both men looked very worried. Jimmy had not shown up to teach his classes or to coach basketball practice the previous day, which was completely out of the ordinary. Jimmy almost never missed school or practice. He would rather show up sick than feel like he was letting the kids down. And he definitely wouldn't stay home without calling to let somebody know he was not going to come in. Now, the day before, when Jimmy hadn't shown up, both of these men had told themselves that, maybe there had been some sort of miscommunication, that, perhaps Jimmy had let somebody in the office know he wasn't coming in, but that didn't get relayed. But now, Jimmy was gone for a second day in a row, and nobody at the school had any record of him calling. And now the coach and the administrator really regretted not doing something 24 hours earlier. So the administrator dialed the Shelby County Sheriff's Department, and he said his colleague, Jimmy McLean, had not come into work for 2 straight days, and that was really strange, and he wondered if maybe police could go by Jimmy's house to make sure he was okay. The operator got Jimmy's address and told the administrator that an officer would go to Jimmy's property to do a wellness check right away. A little bit later that morning, at about 10 a.m., 2 Shelby County deputies arrived at Jimmy's house. They went up to the front door and they knocked, but they got no response. And after a little while of just total silence, one of the deputies tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. So he called his boss and got permission to try to force his way into Jimmy's house. The deputy used a simple lockpicking tool to quickly get the door open, and then once it was, he and his colleague stepped inside, and immediately they called their boss back. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Jason Valentine of the Shelby County Sheriff's Department parked in front of Jimmy's house and approached the 2 deputies, who were now standing just outside of the open front door. Lieutenant Valentine put on his gloves and greeted the 2 deputies, and then they stepped aside to let him pass. Once inside, Valentine made his way to the front room of the house, and right away he noticed a large dried blood stain on the other side of the room in front of the fireplace. And just beyond the blood, Valentine saw the dead body of a middle-aged man. Valentine walked over to the body and saw that the man's face, neck, and shirt were also stained with large amounts of dried blood, and the man's limbs looked very stiff, like rigor mortis had set in. And so this, coupled with all the dried blood, made Valentine think that the man had been dead for a while. Valentine began to scan the room. He saw in a nearby leather chair there was a bag with keys sitting on top of it, and then on the couch there was a sports coat laying over the arm. Valentine went to the coat, reached into the inside pocket, and he found a wallet with a driver's license inside of it. And the man in the photo matched the man on the floor. It was Jimmy McLean, and from the looks of it, Jimmy had been murdered. And so at this point, Lieutenant Valentine asked the two deputies outside to come into the house and help him do an initial search. And right away, they noticed there was a whole bunch of high-end electronics that were left untouched all throughout the house. And so this seemed to indicate to the officers that, it didn't seem likely that the person who killed Jimmy had come here to rob him. It seemed like they had come here to kill him. After searching the 4 bedrooms, which all seemed undisturbed, Valentine walked down a long hallway to the door that led to the garage. He entered the garage, and he saw Jimmy's car was parked right there inside, facing the closed garage door. But other than that, there really wasn't much to see in the garage. There were no obvious prints, no sign of blood, no forced entry. So Valentine went back inside the house to keep looking. And a few minutes later, Valentine's fellow county detective, Alan Bean, stepped inside the home, and he was followed by several state forensics officers. Valentine and Bean worked together often, and so Valentine knew Bean had a sharp eye for evidence. And so Valentine right away told him that the front door and the door leading in from the garage had both been locked when police first arrived. And so Bean turned and went right to the front door, and he found that the door itself could be locked from the inside, but if someone had left through that door, they could only lock that door by using a key. Then Bean looked at the entryway of the house, and he saw there was a rug laying nearby, but it was at a strange angle, like somebody had pushed it away from the door. Then something between the rug and the door caught his eye. He crouched down and he signaled for Lieutenant Valentine to come look too. At first, Valentine thought what he was looking at was just some mud on the floor, but Bean pointed at one particular spot within the mud, and what it was a small portion of a shoe print. Now, there wasn't nearly enough of a print to tell what kind of shoe or what size it was, but Bean hoped the forensics team would be able to use this partial shoe print to tell them more at some point. Now, Bean and Valentine both knew that this print could just be the victim's, but there were no other prints anywhere like it on the floor, so it seemed like there was a real chance it belonged to the killer. As forensics officers began to pull the shoe print, Valentine led Bean over to the body. Multiple .40 caliber bullet casings lay on the floor near the dried pool of blood around Jimmy, and so it seemed clear Jimmy had been shot several times. And so Valentine and Bean came up with the same initial theory. Whoever killed Jimmy likely knew him really well. The level of violence inflicted on Jimmy looked like the result of rage that often accompanies a crime of passion. And assuming the killer was indeed close with Jimmy, they very likely had their own house key that they could have used to lock the door on their way out. The forensics team continued their work in the house, and the detectives canvassed the neighborhood to see if someone had seen or heard anything strange. And they found the information they were looking for at the very first house they tried. Jimmy's next-door neighbor told them that he had called the sheriff's department 2 nights earlier when he heard a series of loud popping sounds that maybe could have been gunfire or fireworks. He wasn't sure. Valentine asked if he knew what time that took place, and the man grabbed his phone, scrolled through his recent calls, and saw he had called the sheriff's department at 8:40 p.m. Now, even though Valentine and Bean did not have an official autopsy report from the medical examiner, at this point they both felt confident that this neighbor had actually heard the sound of Jimmy's murder, and that Jimmy had very likely been laying dead in his house for 2 days. The detectives thanked the neighbor and then left and headed back over to Jimmy's house. There, a forensics officer waved them down and handed over Jimmy's phone that had been found inside of his pocket and bagged as evidence. And then a little bit later that day, when Valentine and Bean were back at the station, they did a full data search of Jimmy's phone. And as they combed through Jimmy's text messages and calls, they knew exactly who they wanted to speak to first. The woman who had texted Jimmy right before he died, Carlotta Smith. The day after Jimmy's body was found, Detective Valentine walked Carlotta into an interview room at the sheriff's department. Valentine told her how sorry he was for her loss and how much he appreciated her coming in. Valentine wanted Carlotta to feel very at ease, as if she was just there to help. But in reality, she was already at the top of the investigator's suspect list. By this point, the medical examiner had officially confirmed Valentine and Bean's initial theory that Jimmy had died on the night that neighbor had called police, most likely not long after responding to Carlotta's text. Valentine and Bean had also contacted members of Jimmy's family, and they had learned that Carlotta and Jimmy had been in a serious relationship for about 6 months. And as Jimmy's serious girlfriend, she very likely had a key to his house, and she would also fit the profile of someone who would maybe commit a crime of passion. On top of that, a victim's intimate partners are almost always primary suspects at the beginning of any murder investigation. After Carlotta sat down at the table across from the two detectives, Valentine asked her about the final text message she had sent to Jimmy. Carlotta explained that she tried to text Jimmy every night when she knew he'd be getting home from basketball practice. It was one of the ways they stayed connected while living 3 hours apart. After that, Valentine asked Carlotta if she had her own key to Jimmy's house that she used whenever she came into town, but Carlotta shook her head and said no, she didn't. Valentine seemed very surprised. He said he thought that she and Jimmy were pretty serious and always stayed together when they visited each other. And Carlotta said they were serious, but she actually didn't stay at his house when they visited. She was a religious person, and she just didn't feel right spending the night at the house of a married man. So she had told Jimmy that until his divorce went through, she would stay by herself at a hotel whenever she came to town. Valentine hesitated for a second. He thought Carlotta actually sounded angry, and so he asked her if it bothered her that Jimmy was still married. And when he said this, Carlotta immediately seemed like she might just start crying. She said it absolutely bothered her, and she thought Jimmy was actually kind of dragging his feet with the divorce, and she was kind of tired of it. Valentine knew it was best to just let her keep talking, so he just kept nodding along like he understood exactly what she was going through. And so Carlotta just kept on talking. She went on a rant about Jimmy's wife and how he was still way too friendly with her and how it didn't make sense that this woman was still part of Jimmy's life. Finally, Carlotta trailed off, at which point Valentine asked her for a few more details about where she had been when Jimmy was killed. Carlotta said she had been at home in Nashville, but then she said police really needed to speak to Jimmy's wife. The wife and her son lived close to Jimmy, and the wife just could not seem to let Jimmy go. And Carlotta was sure Jimmy's wife still had a key. Valentine thanked Carlotta for coming in and told her she could leave. And then after she was gone, the detectives couldn't help but feel like Carlotta had not really helped her own cause here. If she was as angry about Jimmy's marriage as she seemed, then perhaps that was her motive to kill Jimmy. The following day, Valentine and Bean brought Jimmy's wife, Carla McLean, and her 19-year-old son, Dwayne Moore, into the station. Valentine and Bean questioned Carla first, and she seemed totally distraught about her husband's death. She said he was such a good man who loved God and loved helping young people. It just didn't make sense that he was gone. But Bean asked the obvious question. Was there any animosity between her and Jimmy during their 4-year separation and now during their initial divorce proceedings? But Carla just shook her head. She said that she and Jimmy were good friends, they just didn't quite work as a romantic couple. So Bean asked Carla if she still had a key to Jimmy's house, since after all, they were on good terms. Carla got a look on her face like she was searching for something, and then she said she didn't think she had a key, and if she did, she had forgotten where it was. Bean and Valentine nodded like that made complete sense, but inside, they did not buy that at all. And they believed Carla was lying right to their faces. Valentine asked Carla where she was on the night Jimmy was killed, and Carla said she'd been home the whole night with her son Dwayne, and he would vouch for her. Valentine nodded and then asked if police could actually have her phone to download her data, because this would be an easy way to confirm where she was and to cross her off their list. Carla immediately reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and put it on the table. She said police could search it all they wanted, she had absolutely nothing to hide. Bean picked up the phone and left the room, and then Carla was escorted out, and then her son, Dwayne, was brought in. Dwayne was quiet and respectful, but at first all he cared about was whether or not his mom was okay. And Valentine said his mom was just fine and she'd be waiting for them as soon as they were done. And so the detectives and Dwayne talked for a short time, and the kid seemed a bit nervous, but he was cooperative. He said he liked and respected Jimmy. They bumped heads sometimes like any stepfather and stepson would, but he thought, Jimmy was overall a good man, and he had no idea who would want to hurt him. Dwayne said he did not have a key to Jimmy's house, and that on the night Jimmy was killed, he was at home with his mom. Valentine thanked Dwayne for coming in, and then led him to an office where his mother was waiting. A little bit later, Bean informed Valentine that all the data on Carla's phone had been gathered up, and so the detectives gave Carla her phone back and told her and Dwayne they were free to go. It would take a while for Bean and other investigators to go through all of Carla's text messages and phone calls, and so while he waited, Valentine got back in touch with a few of Jimmy's family members, and they all said the same thing about Jimmy's wife, Carla. Her relationship with Jimmy was not nearly as good as she wanted people to believe, In fact, she and Jimmy had been fighting recently because Carla wanted him to sell his house and give her half of the profit as part of their divorce. After talking to Jimmy's family, Valentine delved a bit deeper into Carla and Jimmy's financial records, and he found a huge red flag. Carla was the beneficiary of Jimmy's life insurance policy. And so between that policy and the potential sale of the house, Carla stood to make hundreds of thousands of dollars now that Jimmy was dead. So at this point, the detectives had two women, Jimmy's girlfriend and his wife, who were very strong suspects. Jimmy's girlfriend could have murdered him out of anger or jealousy about his marriage, and his wife could have killed him for the money. Over the next couple of days, investigators revisited the crime scene and conducted more interviews, trying to find anything that would directly connect Jimmy's girlfriend or wife to the murder. Then Detective Bean got a call from a forensics officer, and this officer sounded like he had just hit the jackpot. He told Bean they were able to create a reconstruction of the sole of the shoe that left that muddy footprint inside of Jimmy's house. And this shoe was a size 10.5 men's shoe, which was not the size shoe that Jimmy wore. Then the officer said that the forensics team had actually worked directly with Nike, and they were able to determine that the shoe was a Nike Air Force One high top, a favorite among young basketball players. Bean hung up and rushed over to tell Valentine the news, and they both felt exhilarated by it, but also totally confused. This was a huge piece of evidence, but it undercut the theory that one of the two women in Jimmy's life had killed him. Neither Carlotta nor Carla wore that size shoe. And so the detectives thought that this piece of evidence seemed to point to maybe somebody on the high school basketball team that Jimmy coached. Not long after learning about this shoe, Bean and Valentine headed to Memphis, Tennessee to interview students and faculty at the school where Jimmy taught and coached. And right away, things took a bizarre turn. A coach told the detectives that one of the team's star basketball players had recently been exposed as a 22-year-old man who was pretending to be a high schooler so he could dominate the sport and hopefully earn a college scholarship. The school had discovered the player's secret and promptly kicked him off the team after an anonymous call was made to the school district about this kid. Now, the coach said everybody knew Jimmy prided himself on being honest and that he despised the idea of cheating. And so a lot of people at the school thought Jimmy might have been the anonymous caller who sold out the 22-year-old. At this point, Valentine and Bean understood what the coach was getting at. If this 22-year-old player found out that, Jimmy was the guy who called on him, well, maybe he was the one who killed Jimmy for ruining his chances to play in college and maybe make it to the NBA. And to make things even more suspicious, the coach said the disgraced 22-year-old player had recently moved out of the city. The detectives thanked the coach and then tracked down the player's records in the school's front office. Valentine found a local phone number for the player's mother, so he reached out to the woman and asked her to come to the station. The following day, Valentine and Bean sat in the interview room, staring at a woman who either looked extremely young for her age or who had lied to them on the phone about who she was. So before Valentine launched into any questions about the investigation, he asked the woman flat out if she really was this player's mother. The woman just laughed and said no, she was his wife, and then she admitted that she had helped him forge his transcript and listed herself as his mother. This would allow him to go back and pretend to be a high schooler. Valentine and Bean looked at each other and just shook their heads. This all seemed absolutely absurd. Bean asked the woman if her husband had any issues with his coach, Jimmy McClain, or if he believed Jimmy was the one who called the school anonymously and exposed his scam. The woman kept on smiling. She said she didn't know if her husband had a problem with Jimmy, but Jimmy definitely did not call the district, because she did. Because she had caught her husband cheating on her with a high school girl, and she wanted to ruin him. Valentine looked over at Bean again, and then he just sat back in his chair and stared at this woman. This now seemed like something out of a soap opera. But still, even after this woman left, the detectives agreed that the fake high school basketball player was someone who might wear Nike Air Force One shoes. He also could have had problems with Jimmy about something else, and also his story was so strange and calculated and full of lies that Valentine and Bean did not want to rule him out, at least not yet. But just as they started looking deeper into this whole weird scenario with this fraudulent basketball player, something happened 300 miles away that would change the entire investigation. On the night of February 26, 2013, 6 days after Jimmy's murder, a woman in pajamas burst into a police station in Crossville, Tennessee, over 4.5 hours from Cordova, where Jimmy was killed. The woman screamed that she was in danger and she needed protection. Several officers got up from their chairs and ran over to her and ushered her into a small office. The police tried to calm her down, but she was frantic, and she kept looking all around her like somebody was following her. The officers told her they could help, but they needed to know what was going on. Finally, the woman took several breaths and calmed down, and then she said somebody had just told her husband who had murdered Jimmy McClain over in Cordova, and now she was worried that somebody would come after them because of what they knew. It took a while for the officers to get all the necessary information from this woman, but when they felt like they had a grasp on the situation, one of the officers rushed to his desk and called the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. Lieutenant Valentine picked up, and he listened to the whole crazy story about this woman in pajamas. And information from that call led Valentine and Bean to do another search of Jimmy's wife's phone records. And during that search, they found what they were looking for. On the day of the murder, Jimmy's wife Carla had been texting with a young man in town who was a known drug dealer, a guy who everybody called Pooh. And Pooh definitely had the connections and the skills to have somebody killed. On March 5th, 2013, about 2 weeks after Jimmy's murder, 2 undercover cops sat in an unmarked car not far from Pooh's house. They were conducting surveillance on the house and waiting for Pooh to do something they could bring him in for, and they didn't have to wait long. The officers watched Pooh step out of his house, and he was clearly carrying a gun. And so the officers got out of their car and called out to Pooh, saying they needed to speak to him. But Pooh didn't waste any time. He ditched his gun into the yard and then took off running towards the back of his house. The 2 cops followed on foot, but Pooh sprinted through the alley, he ran between a couple of houses, and then he turned onto a residential street. Pooh looked over his shoulder, and the cops were nowhere to be seen, so he slowed down a bit and kept heading towards the end of the road. Suddenly, tires screeched on the road, and Pooh saw a SWAT vehicle come to a stop right in front of him. Pooh turned and tried to run again, but 2 members of the SWAT team leapt out of the vehicle, and they were fast. They caught up to Pooh and tackled him to the ground, and Pooh relented and did not put up a fight. The SWAT team would search him, and they would find baggies full of pills and also marijuana. And then a few minutes later, the undercover cops who had been conducting the surveillance, they arrived, and they had retrieved the gun that Pooh had thrown into the yard. And so now the police had enough evidence to hold Pooh on drug and weapons charges. A little bit later that day, Pooh sat inside of an interview room across from Detectives Valentine and Bean and several other investigators at the Shelby County Sheriff's Department. Valentine stared across the table at Pooh and then glanced down at Pooh's phone that police had confiscated. Valentine held up the phone, leaned across the table, and showed Pooh a photo. Pooh looked at the photo and then lowered his eyes. The picture was of a handgun and piles of cash sitting on a blanket. Then Valentine pointed out several text messages that Pooh had sent and received from Jimmy's wife, Carla, leading up to the time of Jimmy's murder. Valentine said it did not take a huge leap to think maybe Pooh had been hired to kill Jimmy. Pooh was silent for a minute, then he raised his head and looked at Valentine and the other investigators, and he said he would tell them everything. Based on information provided by Pooh, cell phone data, evidence at the scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Jimmy McClain on the night of February 20th, 2013. On that night, the killer slouched down in the driver's seat of their car that was parked just a few houses away from Jimmy's. In their hand, they clutched a Smith & Wesson Sigma, a .40 caliber pistol. A little after 8:30 p.m., the killer saw Jimmy's car pull up in front of his house and then reverse into his garage. The killer watched the garage door close all the way, hiding Jimmy inside the house, and at that point, the killer got out of their car, they crouched low to the ground, and ran across Jimmy's front yard, not noticing they had just gotten mud on the underside of one of their shoes. A moment later, the killer reached into their pocket and pulled out a single key on a key ring. They took a breath, clutched the gun tighter in their hand, and then crept out of the bushes. Staying low, they approached Jimmy's front door and quietly slipped that key into the lock. The killer raised the gun, unlocked the door, and threw it open, and as they did, the door slid a small rug out of the way, and the killer stepped right inside and then slammed the door behind them. And Jimmy was standing right there in the room. and when Jimmy turned around and saw a person in his house with a gun, he just started running, trying to get away. But the killer was ready, and they began shooting at Jimmy. Jimmy screamed out and fell to the floor right in front of the fireplace, and blood began pouring out of his shoulder and back, and the killer didn't even move. They stood right there firing over and over again, aiming at Jimmy's neck and head until the gun was empty. And after it was empty, the killer just stood there for a minute, staring at Jimmy's now lifeless body. Then they turned, calmly walked out of the front door, closed it, and locked it using that key. Then the killer crouched down, ran back across the lawn to their car, hopped inside, and sped all the way across town to their house. And once they were inside, they went right to their bedroom, hoping their mother had no idea they had even left. It would turn out the drug dealer Pooh provided Jimmy's killer with the murder weapon, but Pooh himself did not kill Jimmy. Jimmy's killer was his own 19-year-old stepson, Dwayne Moore, Carla's son. It would turn out Dwayne and Jimmy's relationship was far more volatile than Dwayne let on to police. Jimmy's adherence to his kind of obsessive routines and his belief that things should be done a very particular way had made it difficult for him to get along with his stepson, who he thought was kind of aimless and had no structure in his life. And so in an effort to combat this, Jimmy became a very strict stepfather to Dwayne, imposing all kinds of rules on the young man. And eventually, Jimmy kicked Dwayne out of the house when he caught Dwayne smoking weed. Dwayne had been on the investigators' radar from the beginning. As Jimmy's stepson, Dwayne made a logical suspect. But it was not until the woman in pajamas rushed into that police station with a wild story to tell that things began to fall into place. It turned out the woman in pajamas' husband was Dwayne's favorite uncle, and Dwayne had apparently spilled a whole bunch of information about Jimmy's murder to him, including Pooh's involvement. And so when Pooh was brought into custody, he admitted that he had gotten Dwayne a gun, but he said it was not the gun he'd photographed with the stacks of cash, and he said he had not killed Jimmy. Then Pooh told police that Dwayne often used his mother's cell phone, and so all those text messages they found to and from Pooh were actually with Dwayne, not Carla. Carla really had no idea what was going on. After Pooh spoke to investigators, they searched Dwayne and Carla's house, and they discovered that Dwayne had several pairs of basketball shoes that were size 10.5. He was definitely the one who had left that footprint at Jimmy's house. And soon after that, Dwayne would confess to the murder. But he said he didn't kill Jimmy just out of spite for how strict Jimmy had been. Instead, he said he had committed the murder because he believed Jimmy was mistreating his mother and trying to rip her off by not selling the house. Dwayne was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison without parole. He will be 43 years old when he is finally released. The University of Central Arkansas, Jimmy's alma mater, went on to create the Jimmy McLean Scholarship Fund to celebrate Jimmy's life in sports and to honor his dedication to mentoring student athletes. August 9th, 1989, 23-year-old Duncan McPherson pulled his little red car into a parking lot inside of a lush green valley in Vienna, Austria. After parking his car, Duncan reached across his middle console and he grabbed an apple out of a bag, and then he took a bite and just admired the unbelievable landscape all around him. He was near the Austrian Alps, and so there were literally just mountains jutting up everywhere. Duncan, who was originally from Canada, had been this highly touted, unbelievable first-round draft pick by the New York Islanders back in 1984. The Islanders are a professional ice hockey team in the United States. But despite Duncan's incredible promise and athleticism, he just couldn't ever get it together, and so he never actually made the New York Islanders' big league roster. And so, in 1989, Duncan started to realize that maybe his hockey career was coming to an end. But instead of just hanging up his skates in frustration, Duncan decided he would pursue a different type of career that kept him still within the hockey world. He would become a coach. And so, in 1989, Duncan had agreed to coach this small-time professional hockey team in Scotland. And for Duncan, his thought was, I'll go there, I'll learn how to be a good coach, and then down the road, I'll maybe have the opportunity to coach much more prominent and prestigious teams. But before moving to Scotland and beginning this new career, Duncan decided what he really needed right now was just to take a break. Because for basically his whole life, Duncan had been playing hockey around the clock practically 7 days a week. You don't get to become a first-round draft pick unless hockey is your life. And so Duncan thought, you know what, before I begin this huge life transition, I'm gonna just kick back and relax and go on a huge European vacation. And one of the first stops of this vacation was going to be the Austrian Alps right in front of him. However, he wasn't just going to look at these incredible mountains, he was going to snowboard down them. Or more specifically, he was going to learn how to snowboard on these incredible mountains. And so Duncan finished eating his apple and then chucked the core into the bag. And then he hopped out of his car, shut the door, locked it, and then began walking across the parking lot towards the white gondola station. A gondola is like a ski lift, but much bigger. It's kind of like a small bus with lots of windows, and it's connected to a cable, and that cable, which is elevated off the ground, pulls you up and down mountains. Now, typically, people ride gondolas just for the incredible view of the mountain from up high. But some gondolas are actually in place to take people to specific locations in the mountain. And typically, these locations are areas that are not accessible otherwise. You need a gondola to get there. And in Duncan's case, the gondola that he was about to hitch a ride on was of the latter variety. It carried passengers from the station near this parking lot high up into the Austrian Alps, up to about 10,000 feet of elevation, where there was another gondola station called the Eisgrot Mountain Station. And right next to the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station was a very unique ski resort called the Stubai Glacier. And overwhelmingly, this ski resort was the reason why people were taking this gondola. This ski resort was unique not only because it was very hard to get to, you basically had to take a gondola or hike up to it, but also because the actual slope that skiers and snowboarders would use at this resort was not just a snowy mountainside like virtually all other ski resorts around the world are. No, instead, the Stubai Glacier ski resort was a glacier, and so people were literally skiing and snowboarding on a glacier, hence the name. And a glacier, in simple terms, is just a huge swath of thick, permanently frozen ice. And so, in the warmer months, when other ski resorts around the world were not able to continue operations because there was no snow, or it was too warm to make snow, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort did not have that problem. Because, in those warmer months, they could just drive their huge snowcat tractors with their big rakes behind them all over the slope, the glacier, and their rakes would basically chop up the top layer of the ice, turning it into powder for people to ski on, which allowed them to basically stay open every day of the year. And so, Duncan, back down in the parking lot, he walked over to the gondola station, he bought his gondola ticket, and then he hitched a ride on the first gondola that swung through the station. And after a slow but beautiful ride up into the mountains, where all that lush greenery down below in the valley was replaced by jagged snow and ice up in the Alps, Duncan finally saw the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort and the glacier itself right behind it that stretched up to the top of the mountain. A few minutes later, the gondola Duncan was on arrived at the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station, and Duncan, along with the others inside of the gondola, hopped off, and then Duncan immediately walked over to the resort and headed into the equipment rental store. And after getting his snowboard and his boots and all the other equipment he would need, he headed right back outside to wait for his instructor to arrive. Duncan had previously purchased a lesson with an instructor at the resort. It was set for 11 a.m. And so Duncan, he's out there at the foot of this glacier, and right at 11, an instructor walks over and introduces himself, and Duncan and the instructor immediately start getting into the basics of snowboarding, how to put your boots into your bindings, how to use the edges of your board. And then for a little while, the instructor and Duncan didn't go up the glacier. Instead, they just kind of worked on some basics on the flat ground right there. And then after the instructor felt like Duncan was ready to go, they both walked over to the tow rope, which is a way to get to the top of the slope. There's a cable that kind of rotates from the top to the bottom of the mountain, and there are all these bars attached to the cable, and skiers and snowboarders grab the bar while standing on their snowboard or their skis, and they literally get pulled up the mountain. And so Duncan and the instructor grabbed onto the tow rope, they made their way to the top of the glacier, and from there they pushed over to the start of the run. And once they were there, the instructor strapped into his snowboard, and then Duncan strapped into his, and then they were off. very slowly making their way, kind of like a falling leaf pattern. Duncan was not just going straight down the mountain. He's a beginner. And so it's very slow, very controlled. And as they went down, the instructor's giving Duncan tips, how to stay more on his edge, how to slow down, how to speed up. And very quickly, the instructor saw that Duncan was so good at balancing, his legs were so strong, likely because he was a professional hockey player. And so the instructor was telling Duncan the whole time they're going down how unbelievably good he was doing for his first lesson. And so finally, after about an hour of very slowly making their way all the way down this glacier, they reached the bottom where they had first been doing some flat ground stuff. And when they got there, it had started to rain. And it was raining bad enough that lots of people on the mountain were abandoning the mountain and running inside of the resort to get out from under the rain. And so the instructor, he looked at his watch and he realized they were almost at 1 p.m., which was the end of their lesson. And he said to Duncan, I don't think we have time to go back up. Plus it's raining. Duncan said he didn't care about the rain, but he also understood that, it wasn't ideal conditions. And so they decided that even though there was a few minutes left, they would just cancel the lesson right there, and they would actually just go inside and grab lunch together. And so they made their way out of the rain into the resort, and when they went inside the resort, the instructor noticed that Duncan's sweater, which was underneath his yellow rain jacket, was totally soaked. And so he offered to Duncan, hey, do you want to take your sweater off and I'll hang it up inside my office? And, by the end of the day, it should be dry. And Duncan thought, great, that's fine. So he took off his wet sweater, he gave it to the instructor, and while the instructor was going to his office, Duncan went into the gift shop and he just bought a new sweater for the day. And after that, Duncan had his new sweater on with his rain jacket over it, and then he met the instructor in the cafeteria, where they both sat down and had a nice meal. They got to know each other a little bit better. After they were done eating, both of them looked out the window and saw the rain had subsided, but in its place was lots of fog that was rolling in, and so very few people were going back onto the mountain. But the instructor told Duncan that, hey, you did so good today that you should really go back out there on your own this afternoon and practice. Do some runs, go nice and slow, same as I was teaching you. And then tomorrow, when we have our follow-up lesson, we can maybe, get into some more advanced things. Duncan thought that was a great idea. He said he would definitely go out there and practice on his own. And then the two men cleaned up, and the instructor made his way to meet his next client, and Duncan headed right outside, grabbed his snowboard, and began walking towards the tow rope.
심장의 소리가 커져 너의 눈빛은 나를 끌어 이 순간 멈추지 마 우린 끝까지 달려가 심장의 소리 들리니 Can you hear 너와 나 하나 되어 춤을 춰 Oh yeah 멈출 수 없는 이 떨림에 우리 심장의 소리로 달리는 소리로 우리 심장의 소리로 너와 나의 공간 속에 모든 감각이 깨어나 서로에게 더 깊이 이 리듬에 몸을 맡겨봐 심장의 소리가 커져 너의 눈빛은 나를 끌어
The next morning, Duncan's snowboard instructor arrived a little bit early to work. And so after getting off the gondola, he made his way over to the resort and he grabbed a cup of coffee in the same cafeteria where he and Duncan had eaten the day before. And then after finishing that coffee, the instructor grabbed his snowboard and the rest of his gear and then headed outside to meet Duncan in the meeting spot they had both agreed on. But when it was time for the lesson to start, Duncan didn't show up. And so the instructor for a second thought, was there somewhere else we were going to meet? Did I get the time wrong? But he checked the time and he remembered the conversation he had with Duncan. They were going to meet at the foot of the tow rope and he was right there and Duncan wasn't. And so he thought, okay, maybe Duncan's running late. But he waited and waited and waited and Duncan never showed up. The instructor was bummed because he and Duncan really had kind of become friends the day before and he was looking forward to teaching Duncan some more today. But the instructor knew it was pretty common for tourists to cancel their follow-up snowboard or ski lessons. It's like they show up for that first day, they get really into it, they plan on going the next day, but then other distractions in their vacation pull them elsewhere and they no-show for the lesson. And so the instructor didn't take it personally. He just assumed that, Duncan had found something else to do that was more fun. But the instructor knew he would see Duncan again because Duncan's sweater was still sitting in the instructor's office. 1 week later, Duncan's parents, who were back home in Saskatoon, Canada, got a very unexpected phone call from the Dundee Tigers hockey team, which was the professional hockey team in Scotland that Duncan was going to go coach after this big European vacation. The team rep for this hockey team asked the parents if they knew where their son was because he had not shown up for his first day of work. And Duncan's parents, they immediately were like, that doesn't make any sense. He was so excited about this job. This is a really big deal for him. He would never miss the first day. And so the parents told the team rep that they would try to get in touch with Duncan, and as soon as they did, they'd be in touch with the team, and the team rep said they would do the exact same thing for the parents. However, after this call, the parents quickly realized that trying to get in touch with their son was going to be nearly impossible. They knew Duncan had gone on this big European vacation, but they didn't have his itinerary. They didn't know what countries he was going to, in what order. They really only knew that he was really excited and he was just going to be on vacation. That was kind of it. And remember, this is 1989. They can't just call Duncan. There weren't cell phones. They didn't have the easy modern ways that we all communicate instantly. And so the parents are like, who do we even call? Where do we go? What do we do? And so ultimately, even though this felt kind of dramatic at the time, the parents decided to file a missing person report with Interpol, which is an organization that connects police across international lines. However, the parents quickly learned that this missing person report was not going to become a high priority item for any police anywhere in Europe, because their son was 23, he's healthy, he's strong, he's smart, he's of sound mind, and really all that had happened was Duncan had missed a single day of work on the back end of a huge vacation. So there's lots of reasons why that could have happened. Maybe he extended his vacation. Yeah, it's not professional, but it's totally possible. Or maybe he doesn't want to take the job after all. Or maybe he's just running late. I mean, there's a lot of very logical explanations for why Duncan didn't show up. And so, in short, the parents were told that if you want to find your son right now and not just wait for him to reappear, well, you better go looking yourself. And without hesitation, that's exactly what Duncan's parents did. They packed up a couple of suitcases and they headed to Europe to go find their son. Because to them, it felt like something was wrong here and there was no time to waste. But again, the parents have no idea where their son would have gone in Europe. And so they don't really have a good starting point. They don't know who to talk to, but they just began chasing down every single seemingly insignificant lead they came across. And as they traveled all over Europe, they hung up thousands and thousands of flyers that showed their son's face, said he was missing, and here's a number to call if you know where he is. But despite these efforts, the parents really got nowhere. That is, until about a month into their search, when still they have not found Duncan, they have no idea where he is, they've chased down all these leads, they've all dead-ended, and at this time, the parents convinced several news outlets around Europe to air a segment on their news about Duncan. And one of those missing person segments aired in Austria. And the news anchor in Austria, when they were doing this segment, they described the car that Duncan was almost definitely driving when he went missing. It was that little red car. The parents had discovered in chasing down their leads that their son had borrowed the little red car from a childhood friend who used to play hockey with him, and the friend had told the parents that he had lent it to Duncan, and Duncan had told him he would have it for a week and then return it. But Duncan had never returned the car. And so the anchor in Austria does this segment about how Duncan is missing, and if you have information, come forward. They describe the little red car, and sure enough, not long after this segment aired in Austria, somebody found Duncan's car. It was still sitting in that parking lot right near the Stubai Glacier gondola. Immediately, when Duncan's parents heard about this, they flew to Vienna, Austria, and they met with police who brought them out to look at their son's car. They hadn't moved it. It was still just sitting where he had left it. And then also police showed the parents what they had found inside of the car, which included Duncan's passport, a letter to his girlfriend, where he talked about how excited he was to go to Scotland, and also a bag of rotten fruit. The police also told the parents that now, with the discovery of this vehicle, they were going to really lean into this missing person case to try to find their son, and that the next day they were going to launch this huge search of the area near where his car was to hopefully find Duncan. And so the parents, who were now cautiously optimistic that they might get some answers, they left the police and they went to a local hotel to rest up before the next day when they would be up early and join this huge search party. But when they got to that local hotel, they did what they always did everywhere they went in Europe. They began handing out all these missing person flyers with Duncan's face on them to everybody they saw in the lobby. They began hanging them up all over the hotel. And sure enough, just by completely random chance, they handed one of these flyers to Duncan's snowboard instructor. They handed it to him, he looked at it, and he did a double take, and he was like, I know him. And he explained how he taught Duncan how to snowboard, and then Duncan didn't show up the next day, and he just figured, okay, he blew it off to go do something else, but he'd come back for his sweater, but he never came back for his sweater, and he never heard from Duncan again. And so the parents, they have been searching all of Europe for a month, and they haven't talked to anybody who knew Duncan. They've gotten nowhere, and now they've just randomly stumbled on probably the last person to see Duncan before he went missing. And so they kept asking the instructor, give us more information. What was his attitude like? Was he stressed out? Was he scared? Was he worried about something? Where did he go? Give us anything. But the instructor really didn't have that much more information to offer, and so he tried to answer all their questions, but really just finally said, look, I'm sorry, all I know is after we ate lunch together on the 9th, Duncan said he was going to go out and do some practice runs, but I never actually saw him go up. I didn't see him come down. I just assumed he went up there and was kind of on his own for the day. And then, of course, the next day, I didn't see him, and he never came back, and so I'm sorry, that's all I know. And so the parents finally said, thank you so much for the information. Please get in touch with us if you remember anything. And the instructor said he would. And then after that, the parents made their way to their room and they went to bed. The next morning, the parents got up early and they headed to that parking lot where Duncan's car was. And there were all these people, police officers and volunteers that were there to be a part of this big search party. And so after the parents explained to the leaders of the search party what the instructor had told them, that very likely their son had been up at the Stubai Glacier ski resort when he went missing, the entire search party quickly hopped on gondolas and made their way up there. And all day, this search party combed this glacier up and down. They walked all around to the backside of this mountain. They rappelled down cliffs and they hiked all over this entire segment of the mountain. But nobody found anything that gave away where Duncan had gone. And the next day, it was the same story. Huge search party looking everywhere, expanding the search, not just Stubai Glacier, but basically all over this entire swath of mountain range. But still, they found nothing. And so, at the end of the second day, the authorities went up to Duncan's parents and they told them that unfortunately, we can't continue this search. We're calling it off. But Duncan's parents, they didn't call off the search. They continued searching for another 14 years. And over that time frame, they went back to Stubai Glacier over and over and over again. They searched it up and down. They knew all the staff members. They knew all the nooks and crannies of the entire place. But they never found any sign of their son. Fast forward to July of 2003, so 14 years after Duncan had gone missing. And a Stubai Glacier ski resort employee was riding the tow rope towards the top of the mountain when they noticed there was a bright yellow piece of trash right in the middle of the slope. And so the employee rode the tow rope just a little bit higher, and then he let go and skied down to this yellow thing. He reached down and he began pulling on this piece of yellow, and suddenly he stopped. And absolutely horrified, he realized this was not trash. While no one knows for sure what happened to Duncan, here is the leading theory that Duncan's family and authorities, for the most part, agree on. Back on August 9th, 1989, after having lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan was feeling motivated to go back out and take some practice runs. And so he headed outside, he looked up at the glacier, there's all this fog rolling in, but it's not raining, and so nobody's on the slope, and so it's perfect for a beginner. He's going to have this place to himself. And so he grabs his board, he makes his way over to the tow rope, he straps in, he grabs onto a bar, and he makes his way to the top. Once he gets off, he makes his way over to the start of the run, he puts his other foot into his binding, he makes sure he's all set, and then he stood up and began slowly kind of waffling his way down the completely vacant and very foggy slope. And as he was going along, he got more and more confident and began going a little bit faster and a little bit faster until finally he was basically just bombing it down the mountain, relying on his natural balance and strength to kind of keep him up. And then all of a sudden, he caught an edge and flipped forward and smashed into the ground. And when he did, he broke his leg. The unique danger to humans when it comes to glaciers is something called a crevasse. Basically, cracks form in the ice, and sometimes these cracks can be massive, like mind-bogglingly massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet, that if you fall into this thing, you're done. No one's getting you out of there. You are falling either to your death, or you're falling so far down that no one can get to you. Or, like in the case of Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, they had the issue of little crevasses forming kind of all over the place. Especially if it rained, the rain would begin to crack the ice, or if maybe it was warmer than usual, the ice would crack here and there. And so the resort was really good about constantly patrolling their slope to make sure no crevasses had formed anywhere on the slope. And so when you got to Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, you were warned that there is such a thing as a crevasse. This is a real glacier, so make sure you're looking around and don't fall into one. Well, because it had rained, a crevasse had formed, a small one, like a pothole, in the slope, but because it was so foggy because of the rain, as Duncan was bombing down, he didn't see it, and that's what he caught his edge on, causing him to fall and break his leg. And so Duncan, he's now stranded in the middle of the slope. He's not close enough to the bottom to where he could pull himself into the resort. He's not close enough to the top where he could get himself up there and talk to the tow lift operator. And so he's just kind of stranded. There's nobody on the mountain. It's so foggy, nobody can see him from the resort. And so he's just stuck in agonizing pain, wondering what he's supposed to do. At the same time this was happening, another ski resort employee was climbing into one of those big snowcat tractors at the top of the glacier. These tractors were what the resort used to chop the top layer of ice and turn it into snow. And because it had rained that day, a lot of the snow had melted, and so this employee needed to basically go over the entire slope from top to bottom and grind up the ice and make some new snow. And so the employee hopped in the cab of this tractor, shut the door, turned on the engine, turned on the back rake, which in your head, picture a long stretch of metal dragging behind this tractor that had rotating blades that cut into the snow as it moved along. And so this employee, after turning on the rake and making sure everything worked, they drove the snowcat and the rake onto the start of the downward slope, and they began crisscrossing back and forth across the entire slope, turning it all into fresh snow. And as this employee drove, they were very careful not to go too quick because they knew they couldn't see very far with all of the fog. And so they're going like 1 or 2 miles an hour, being very cautious. And then suddenly, at the last second, they see something in the snow. It kind of appeared out of the fog. And so the employees swerved as fast as they could to avoid hitting it. And they did narrowly miss it. Their big tank-like treads that are on these tractors just missed running this thing over. However, the back rake with the rotating blades did not miss this object. It went right over it. The employee immediately parked the snowcat and then leapt outside and ran over to see what this thing was. And when they got there, they could not believe what they saw. It was Duncan, and all those rotating blades that had crossed over him had basically mutilated him. One of his arms had been cut off, one of his legs was nearly cut off, but it's believed Duncan was actually not dead. The injuries were horrible, but they would not necessarily have killed him outright. He would bleed to death without help, but in theory, he could have been saved. But the employee, even though this was a total accident, totally panicked. and decided that because it was so foggy, no one must have seen this. No one was around, and so no one would know that they were the ones who ran this guy over. And so instead of helping Duncan, they just tied him up and dragged him behind the snowcat off of the glacier over to this area where this employee knew there was a very deep crevasse. And they chucked Duncan, who might have been alive at this point, into the crevasse along with his arm and his severed leg, and then the employee used the snowcat tractor to rake over the crevasse. They filled it all in and packed it down, and then they drove down the rest of the way and just hoped no one would ever know. But over the course of the next 14 years, the glacier would melt more and more each year until finally Duncan's yellow jacket popped through the ice. And that's what the resort employees saw as they were going up the tow lift and thought it was trash. It was actually Duncan's jacket. They skied over, they tried to pull it out of the snow, only to then see, literally in the ice, Duncan McPherson looking right back up at them. And Duncan still looked like he was 23 years old because he had been frozen this entire time. According to the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, Duncan must have just fallen into this crevasse and died. That's what they say happened, and some authorities say that is what happened. But when they pulled Duncan out of the ice and they found his body had been chopped apart and his snowboard had even been chopped apart, that told a very different story. As for the snowcat driver who drove over Duncan, they were never actually officially identified or charged with any crime because there was a statute of limitations that had run out by 2003. And so no one has ever been held accountable for Duncan's death. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful.